I went out there like. to start. Okay. Yeah. Okay, good evening, everyone. Please welcome to the Philadelphia Liberation Center. My name is Saskia. I'm an organizer of the Black Alliance for Peace. This is my second time here, and one thing I love about this space is the sort of people that come by, and I feel like I'm in a room of other radical people and people with questions that are constantly challenging our world. So thank you for joining us today for our panel on the 20 years legacy of the War on Terror, Iraq, U.S. Empire, and America's miseducation system. Today, we are joined by Dr. Nazia Kazi and Hiram Rivera. Nazia Kazi is an associate professor of anthropology and an author of Islamophobia, Race, and Global Politics. Her first book addresses the legacy of the War on Terror on American race and class politics. She's working on a second book that will reflect upon the relationship between the Central Intelligence Agency, Islamophobia, and right-wing Islamist movements. Hiram Rivera is the executive director of the Community Resource Hub. The Hub provides research and technical assistance to organizations across the country running defund and police abolition campaigns. He is the former director of the Philadelphia Student Union and a trainer with the School of Unity and Liberation, with over 18 years of organizing experience on issues of education, juvenile, and criminal justice. As I mentioned, I'm an organizer with the Black Alliance for Peace. I am also an economist, a writer, a poet, and right now I am a middle school social studies teacher, and so I'm teaching 6th, 7th, and 8th graders, trying to teach them about the world. And so it's interesting that we're having this conversation about our education system because, you know, even though I have this like sort of academic background, I'm trying to relay this information to a group of 11 to 14-year-olds and realizing that we're almost on the same page as far as what we've been taught and what we know. So when I think about 20 years ago, I was 7 years old, and all I remember of 9/11 anyways is leaving school early. And I think most American people mostly recall where they were more than they do why it happened, or what they were told was happening, because of course public discourse was sort of offered to us. And so I'm wondering, Dr. Kazi, if you could share why we should even be having this conversation 20 years later, why it's important to commemorate this milestone, and what is even the history of U.S. involvement in Iraq? Break it down for us as if maybe we're middle schoolers.
Sure. Thank you so much for the introduction and all of you for being here. I think it's Chinua Achebe who wrote, "Until the lion learns to write, the hunter will always tell the story." And when we think about this story of the U.S. involvement in Iraq, I think one of the most important questions we might ask ourselves is where we begin telling that story. So do we start, for instance, working backward, say with the rise of ISIS, which is an organization that is a direct result of the U.S. invasion, an organization that visited untold suffering on the Muslim world. I think a lot of Americans think ISIS was out fighting against the West, but actually most of their victims were right there in the so-called Middle East. Working backwards, do we start the story with the insurgency that popped off in Iraq soon after the U.S. invasion, right? And the insurgency, of course, surprised the United States because we have that kind of imperialist arrogance, that hubris, that we can easily win wars, which history has proven time and again to be false. The insurgency was such a surprise to the U.S. that they tried to blame it on foreign actors going into Iraq and causing the insurgency. It's always someone else's fault, right? Not the actual Iraqi people who had seen their country basically destabilized overnight. Which kind of reminds me of Susan Rice, one of Obama's top advisors, said that George Floyd uprisings were Russian actors. Not the expansion of police forces under Trump, Obama, Biden, Bush, Clinton, etc., right? So the insurgency in Iraq was so horrifying that the US even created a ban on the images that the American media was allowed to show. Our media was not allowed to show even a flag-draped coffin because the US establishment wanted to keep alive the idea that this was that we were winning. Or do we start the story with the 2003 invasion itself, right? I mean, that might be the most obvious place to start. But the invasion and the war that followed has left estimates of close to 1 million people dead. It has not only destroyed key historical sites, and of course, as an anthropologist, I must remind you that Iraq is itself like the cradle of civilization with some of the most, or used to have the most sort of UNESCO protected sites. The US Army literally brought in anthropologists, archaeologists, to consult on which regions it should be careful to not bomb because they were so historically valuable, and then those regions were systematically looted by US forces in the toppling of the Iraqi government. Environmental scientists have written at length about the environmental impact of the US invasion of Iraq. And of course, the Iraq invasion of 2003 was drummed up by both Republicans and Democrats. It was Joe Biden who refused to allow any voices that were opposed to the invasion to testify in front of Congress. So he was one of the key architects of the US war in Iraq. And of course, Colin Powell, a Republican, knew he was lying about the weapons of mass destruction when he gave his important speech at the United Nations trying to convince the global community to support this war. Or we could start the story even before that, right, with the sanctions regimes of George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton. Sanctions, I'm sure you're all familiar with, that had such a devastating impact that it left 500,000 Iraqi children to starve to death, which Madeleine Albright said what?
It was worth it.
It was worth it. It was worth it, she said. But of course, the main impact of the sanctions was actually less starvation and more the medical impacts of it, where you saw in the aftermath of the US sanctions regime in Iraq, diseases that haven't existed for hundreds of years for humans re-emerge. Diseases that could have been easily treatable by very skilled nurses and doctors in Iraq who didn't have access to the medical supplies because of these sanctions. Iraq didn't even have material to sanitize things in their hospitals because of the sanctions, but what they did have a lot of was gasoline. So as Jeremy Scahill has reported, Iraqi hospitals during the sanctions regime smelled like this toxic blend of gasoline and death, So we could start the story there. Or we could start the story with the first US war in Iraq, which was waged in part so the US could erase the Vietnam syndrome, right? That we had this bad war that really defeated public morale in the American state. And now we need to wage a good, quick, easy, winnable war. So you see, it's just another pawn in sort of imperialist designs. You could start the story with the decades-long US alliance with Saddam Hussein, who, of course, at the time of the 2003 invasion, he's Hitler, he's the boogeyman, he's the worst thing to ever happen. But for decades, he was a close ally of the United States. You could start the story with the 1980s and the Iran-Iraq war, that the US was at least officially on the side of Iraq, but low-key actually on both sides, right? On both sides of the war, because massive devastation in the region helps advance the ruling class interests in the region. But here we are at the PSL, right, the Liberation Center, and we're obviously in a space that is committed to a critique of capitalism. And so I think the story needs to start in the 1960s with Abdul Karim Qasim, who wanted to see Iraq control its own resources, most importantly its oil resources. And this was such a threat to the United States, the rise of this nationalist, resource nationalist, progressive movement, that it toppled it in a particularly interesting way. And that way was to give rise to Saddam Hussein. The US literally went and found Saddam Hussein and armed and trained and funded him to take Abdul Karim Qasim out of power. And thus begins this decades-long US involvement in Iraq. And I think that is an important place to start this story and sort of at least kick off an answer to your question.
Yeah. I'm really fascinated with this idea of when it started because, of course, we have, this the word invasion involvement that you use is, I think, important for this conversation because 2003, of course, is when the attack happened, but of course, we're talking about decades of this conversation happening and things happening in the 90s, and so it wasn't really a surprise to, I mean, of course, the changes in policy happened quickly, but they had been discussing this for a while, different set of interests. And for me, I think the story starts in Haiti because that's where I'm from. Not about Iraq, but about imperialism and my entryway into understanding imperialism. Because right now there's this conversation of U.S. involvement in Haiti, and people are thinking about it as a contemporary issue, but there was an occupation of Haiti that happened in 1915 that ended in 1934, but never really ended. And so anyways, when I think about where did things start and where are they now, I think about how some things never end. They're just, reiterations and evolutions of imperialism and militarism. And so when I think about my students, recently, in light of this conversation, I asked them, what do they know about Iraq, or what do they think of when they think of war on terror? And again, these are like 11 to 14-year-olds, so I wasn't really expecting much. Some of them would answer things like Twin Towers. Some of them said Muslim. And I looked at the textbook to see when it was published. It was published in 2003, so we couldn't even get a conversation started for the curriculum because we have these super old textbooks. And so in this conversation, we're focusing on K through 12 education. And U.S. wars abroad have always been paid for with our lives, and off the backs of working people here at home. So as we're looking back 20 years, Hiram, could you share what the war meant and what it means now for public services like K through 12 education in our country?
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay. Yes. So I'll start with Engels teaches us that in every historical epoch, right, how he puts it, the mode of production and exchange is what dictates how society is organized. Schools play an essential role, right, in that organization of society and creation of citizens, workers, and all that. And so during that industrial period, right, as you all know, schools are set up and built as factories, and that factory model, right, to produce workers. The 70s comes along, right, the beginning of neoliberalism, the privatization, the free market, the anti-unionism, all the stuff that comes with that, right, the exporting of U.S. monopoly capital across the country, and that starts to seep into our schools as well. So with the 80s and Ronald Reagan, it's a pro-choice movement with vouchers, right, because urban schools are so dangerous. It's so horrible. Kids should have opportunities to go out to other districts, other towns to go to school. And then you start moving into the 90s, where a lot of that stuff is starting to happen again. Specifically here in the state of Pennsylvania and focusing on Philadelphia public schools, in the 90s, what you ended up having was a freezing of the funding formula. And so funding formulas are how student states basically dictate or figure out how much money is going to specific school districts based off a formula on needs, so population size, the needs of the students, special needs, English language learners, all of that thing to decide who gets how much funding. Pennsylvania, being the racist state that it is, right, it's a bowl of milk with 2 chocolate chips, one in the West Pittsburgh and one in East Philadelphia, are like, to hell with that, right? We're losing all our money is going to hell. Because a big component of neoliberalism is also that says that governments are not equipped to manage budgets. That should be in the hands of business people, of folks who really understand how to do that, not politicians who just throw it all away, right? And so coming out of that funding formula freeze, when we get into the 2000s, the Philadelphia school district, as school districts all over the world, the country, right, are facing serious budget crises, right? On top of that, you also have these plummeting of test scores, being in the poorest big city in the country, right? That combination mixed with this push coming in from the privatization side that started with the choice, right? The choice movement leads to this fight to take over the Philadelphia school district and the state takeover. right? And so after a number of lawsuits at the state level and the federal level that failed, trying to win more funding, trying to get the funding from the Black Institute in the state of Pennsylvania, Mayor Street at that time negotiates a state takeover with with Harrisburg to take over Philadelphia schools with a promise of bringing more funding. Unfortunately, that funding didn't come. What happened was that then there was this firm, Edison, right, who came in and tried to take over the school district. What they tried to do was literally sell the school district off to this education firm, right? Because again, they said that the local government here in Philadelphia was mismanaging the funding. You had students who couldn't pass their tests, who couldn't do all that, right? And so and that's what happens. You have the state takeover at that time, the School Reform Commission. That said, as always, right, the racist Pennsylvania legislature, in the hands of the governor, is allowed to nominate 3 commissioners, the mayor 2 of them, which always puts the balance right in the state legislature's hands when it comes to Philadelphia public schools. With that, continue to have these budget cuts, The school district of Philadelphia is a perpetual state of crisis, right? Bringing it back to the war in Iraq, right? George Bush, on top of all that, institutes his No Child Left Behind, right? No Child Left Behind was basically a set of policies ultimately that were about punishing schools and school districts for not performing well, right? It was said to raise the floor, right? So think of the students at the bottom of the test was like, and what do we do to raise them up? In this, you have this heavy emphasis on standardized testing, right? But also churn. So the punishment of schools that weren't meeting these testing guidelines. Now again, schools are not getting the funding that they need. So in 2015, 2014, I have high school students here in the city of Philadelphia whose textbook said that Bill Clinton was still the president of the United States. And somehow they're supposed to pass these standardized exams. In schools that also don't have heat, also don't have air conditioning, also don't have a whole bunch of other stuff, right? And so in that, what ends up happening is that through the churn, you have principal after principal who's being fired from the school and then replaced, fired and then replaced, teachers fired and replaced, as if that is going to be conducive to young people's education, right? Another thing that No Child Left Behind said was that it began the process mandating school districts to hand over all information for all students over to the military recruiters. ROTC has always kind of been a thing, but the No Child Left Behind, right? The ROTC programs start to boom. In order to have your child taken out of that program, parents had to go to the school and say, I want my child removed. In states like Florida, if you remove your child, they'll be like, okay, great, then you can't be in the yearbook anymore. And you also can't play on sports teams, right? To ensure that your child's information was handed over to the military at the time that the war was starting to happen. And again, this war was a little different from, let's say, Vietnam, right? Because they didn't want that, when the soldiers come back, they never wanted that to happen. I grew up at that time with the first, like, original George Bush, right? They were wrapping like the yellow ribbons around the trees and all that shit, right? And so you have teachers who also grow up in that and who are teaching that. And you also have weapons manufacturers and military folks who are also getting in the business of education and education curriculum, right? And so what is being taught to students about war, what is being taught to students about the United States' impact around the world is something very different, and is coming from the State Department and is coming from Lockheed Martin, all these places, as opposed to folks who have studied in this thing, right? And so what does that mean for Philadelphia? Fast forward again is, as you have students who cannot meet those testing requirements and schools that cannot meet those testing requirements, and the budget cuts that were happening, especially in 2013, right, when the budget cuts were so immense that the school district fired 700 teachers, they laid off all the counselors, secretaries, school aides, right, some assistant principals, and were like, good luck. And if you don't do this, we also have this plan to shut down, at least at the time, 32 of your high schools, specifically almost exclusively in Black neighborhoods in Philadelphia. Right, when I first came to Philadelphia, I lived over here on Oxford and American. I had to move, I got priced out back in like 2012 or whatever. This place looks nothing like what I remember. Not at all, right? Because the gentrification happened so fast. And so with that fight, with the school closures that came, you had this gentrification process, right? But the only thing during that immense budget crisis, and remember that, we put 3,000 students in the street in the walkout, right? It was the largest walkout in Philadelphia school district history since the walkout in 1968 for Black studies. It was that impactful, right? Of those 24 schools that eventually got closed, right, 81% of the students impacted were all Black. All those neighborhoods where those schools were closed were sold off to developers, and are now look completely different than what they looked like before in the ever-changing landscape, right, in population of Philadelphia. And so amidst all of that, school closures and firings and all that, the only program that didn't get cut and didn't have its funding impacted was the ROTC. Currently, there are 15 ROTC programs in the city of Philadelphia, all of them in Black, low-poverty neighborhood schools. Chicago, who has a notorious history and its label of being kind of like this murderous row, has the highest concentration of ROTC programs in the school. ROTC programs are sold to the students in Philadelphia as well as your only access to college, as funding for college. Those students who engage in ROTC are seen as the good students and not those troublemakers in the schools, right? For those young people who are undocumented, it's seen as a pathway to citizenship, right? All the different ways that the military is being sold back to our schools as our schools are being transformed to move us into this next stage of, I don't know what the hell, where capitalism is going, right? But this hellscape that we're entering into is preparing students, right, for that. And so when we look at the war, and sometimes often for students, for parents, for all of us, like, the war is one thing, education is nothing. But when you take a step back, you see how these things coincide together. Because through there is where all these young people were being funneled off, right, into the military, because there is nothing else. And as groceries and housing and rent and everything else becomes more and more unaffordable, right, there are more and more young people whose futures are disappearing faster than they can even graduate middle school. And the only thing left for them, right, is to enter in the military and die somewhere else, right? Or kind of roll the dice and take your luck, you know what I'm saying, chances out in these streets. I'll stop.
Yeah, I mean, you don't have to if you want
I'll talk later.
to. As you were talking, I was sort of drifting away and thinking about textbooks again, and like what the U.S. legacy will be when we rewrite this textbook in another 20 years. I don't know how often they're writing textbooks these days. And I don't study the United States because I want to, but it just always comes up when I study imperialism and colonialism. And so when I think about the United States as this pan-European imperial experiment, I wonder what people will remember, which invasions will come to mind first, whether it will be Iraq or, name your country or region of choice. And so Hiram sort of talked about the imprints of K through 12 education, but Dr. Kazi is a university professor, and so I kind of want to shift gears a little bit and talk about what is going on in our college campuses. What are we talking about when we discuss war on terror? How will the war on terror be remembered, or how is it being forgotten today? And what's been your experience in the classroom researching and talking about this particular topic?
Yeah, as Hiram, as you were talking about how militarized the K through 12 setting is, I was, one, horrified, and two, hold my fear. Because I'm like, the college campus, the university setting is so militarized that I dream of doing this activity with my students where I send them out on campus to count how many references to policing and the military can you find in any one campus building, everywhere, right? And for me, when I teach my classes, which are largely focused on the war on terror, anti-Muslim racism, American imperialism, I find time and again this lack of awareness that you are speaking of that comes out of our schools, that comes out of American culture. And for me, especially as we approach the sort of 20th anniversary of September 11th, I was like, oh, like these are kids who only have what they were told about these events. Like, I remember 9/11. I not only remember the attacks of September 11th, but I remember what we in Muslim America had to do, which was like sort of go into hiding immediately, right? Because we were being racially profiled and surveilled and targeted in hate crime. But for a lot of these young learners, all they have is perhaps what they were taught in their school books or what they were taught by watching American films and television, okay? And TikTok and social media. So I actually did a study, right? I did a study on what it is Americans too young to remember September 11th know about it. And 1 in 5, that's 20% of my respondents, thought Saddam Hussein was responsible for 9/11. Okay, so, I mean, well, they tried to sell us that lie at the time, too. And they did a lot to try to convince us of that lie. Now, if you know anything about the Middle East, if you know anything about Iraq, you know that the government of Saddam Hussein is on one side and forces of, Salafi extremism, Al-Qaeda are completely on the other side. Saddam Hussein was violently opposed to such forces and also offered the US immediately after September 11th whatever support in fighting the forces of Al-Qaeda he possibly could. But such details are irrelevant, right, in the US, where we want to paint with a broad brush, a brush that serves imperialist designs. I mean, a guy whose son died on September 11th literally called up the Pentagon and said, "Can you name a bomber that will drop a bomb on Iraq after my son?" And the Pentagon did it, as if Iraq had anything to do with September 11th. So the militarized campus, the university setting, is not only awash in these kind of recruitment activities, but also awash in defense dollars and intelligence dollars. So the CIA, the FBI, the Pentagon are not only recruiting, but are funding and supporting research agendas, So, and not necessarily even research agendas that will serve the desires of the US state, but sometimes just throwing money at like bullshit research projects. So if you wonder why so much of what you read coming out of academia is total nonsense, it's probably because it's taking the place of something that would be less nonsense, right? That doesn't get funding and that doesn't get this kind of material support. So I teach in New Jersey. A lot of my students are from working class backgrounds. They're often the first from their family to go to college. They went to school in New Jersey, and many New Jersey schools have 9/11 memorials in the school buildings. Some of them even have little pieces of steel beam that were parceled out and sent around the world from the Twin Towers to build these memorial sites everywhere. There's a lot of memorializing that happens. Never forget, right? Never forget. But what we are talking about is the fact that you actually need to forget. My study found that these students could all say 2,997 Americans died on September 11th, but they don't even know who carried out the attacks, right? So there's some things that are being remembered, and remembered very vividly. They all know that first responders got like respiratory illnesses and that people got really sick who were involved in the rescue missions, but none of them can tell you who the Mujahideen were or why the US literally armed and trained these right-wing thugs in Afghanistan. None of them. So it's a simultaneous project of remembering and forgetting that we see in the collective memory around September 11th. And I think this question of what happens not only in our education system, but sort of in our hearts and minds when a country, an imperialist country, is at war is really worth thinking about. You guys know Donald Rumsfeld, right? People magazine listed him as like sexiest man of the year during their Iraq war. I know. Debatable. No, but like that is what I mean when I say these are ideological wars, right? These wars are always deeply, deeply ideological. If you look at pictures of Saddam Hussein that were in the American media when they wanted us to support the war, so in 2002 and 2003, when they were trying to convince us that he had weapons of mass destruction, which he didn't, all of the pictures of Saddam Hussein were holding a rifle in his military outfit with his beret and his mustache. And then when the insurgency began, and all of a sudden the US and Americans start coming home in body bags, and the US is seeing their troops being blown up in car bombs and stuff, the pictures of Saddam Hussein are like this disheveled guy, like the pictures you've seen of him right before his execution and stuff. And it's like this really interesting, very sinister, ideological game that's being played here. And hopefully you're all drawing comparisons to what we've seen over the past year and a half, right, with portrayals, for instance, of Putin. A lot of my respondents have never heard of the Abu Ghraib prison torture. People say scandal, but a scandal makes it sound like something that wasn't supposed to happen. But like this hypersexualized torture of inmates at the hands of the US military is absolutely part of the plan. It's not a glitch, it's a feature, right? But it's been forgotten. A lot of people don't know what happened at Abu Ghraib. But I will remind you that when these allegations of torture came out, and George W. Bush had a press conference where some journalists were asking him hard questions about what happened at Abu Ghraib, he said, "This is what makes America great, that you guys can ask me such questions." And you talk about spin, like you can take something like this brutal dehumanization of people who would literally go on to become, really, in very problematic ways, this would turn into not only the insurgency, but ISIS, right? You see George W. Bush taking these questions and being like, see, this is what makes America great. Like, you can ask me about this torture scandal. There was a piece in the New Yorker that did the same thing, where the author says, well, we torture people, but those people, when they torture people, they don't sit and debate about whether it was, a violation of human rights or the Geneva Convention or not. In other words, the way we torture people and then reflect on it is a sign of our exceptionalism, right? Only in America. So, and I'll just close with another little thought. Does anyone know who the richest person in Trump's cabinet was? The person with the most net worth? Betsy DeVos. Betsy DeVos is Secretary of Education because she's married to some ultra rich guy and she's some ultra rich lady, and she's the Secretary of Education. And her brother is Eric Prince, the CEO of Blackwater. Blackwater is a company that has had to change its name so many times because of the egregious assaults on just human life that it's carried out, right? I mean, think about the Nicer Square massacre or a number of other really just horrific things carried out at the hands of this extremely profitable private mercenary company, a military contractor. Right? I mean, and that was that's another key part of like sort of the economic dimensions of the war in Iraq is how, private forces were called upon by an administration that believes in small government, right? So you got to hire these soldiers and stuff like that. So Betsy DeVos is in charge of what we learn in our schools, and she's literally the sibling of the person who was one of the biggest profiteers of the Iraq war, right? So following the money is always enlightening. But it's also obviously very depressing.
I was writing down selective listening, thinking about selective teaching, and how as educators we have this power to teach people whatever we want, of course within the confinements of the curriculum or whoever's, whatever big brother is watching us. So the fact that they could even name the number of casualties is, I think, a little impressive. I mean, of course, it's like, they're missing the point. I think my middle schoolers also are missing the point when they think of Muslims and Twin Towers, but not so far off, but it's sort of the connotation of Muslims, I think, is the problem more than knowing that that's the area of the world that was involved at the time. But sometimes I feel like them in my unknowing. Most of my research is in the political economy. I'm an economist, that's my background. And so I focus on nation building and wealth and poverty, particularly in Black nations. I have a particular interest in Latin America and the Caribbean because I'm from Haiti, and also just other Black countries at large. And it wasn't until I got to college and I was taking a global security class that the conversation of Iraq and how we can tie economics to anthropology and global security and war even came to the forefront of my mind. Sophomore year is also when I was radicalized, so things were happening, a lot of things were happening in my mind. But the concept of policing and criminal justice didn't come into the forefront of my, I guess, politicization until probably like 4 years ago. And so Hiram, you have almost 20 years of experience at the intersection of education and policing and criminal justice. So I'm going to defer this next set of questions to you, please. So we're talking about the war on terror and how devastating its impacts were on the lives of U.S. citizens, people all over the world. And so wondering if you could share how that particular war has shaped policing today, and what has that meant for schools and how we discipline young people in our schools?
Yeah. And I mean, just listening to all this. So props to you for being like, there's so much. Right? I think you're just scratching the surface of all the way these things connect. You link Betsy DeVos and Blackwater, and that's a whole nother topic that we can spend a whole night on talking about. But the issue of policing and how that connects to one, I think we're all pretty familiar with the state of policing at this point, the militarization of police, right? Like, how did we get there? And policing has always been, right? As Geomar writes in his book, policing has always been about counterinsurgency, right? It's slave catchers, it's colonialism, and it's this issue of counterinsurgency. Prisons are also sites of counterinsurgency, right? It is where most of our 60s and 70s revolutionaries were put into torture, right, as a way to try to kill that movement. And so we understand policing primarily to be not about safety, but about protecting capital, protecting private property, and maintaining the order of the bourgeois state that I mentioned before. By the 70s, already moved into this sort of neoliberal phase, right? And stops producing because all the factories get closed down. So the only thing the U.S. is exporting is war, right? The main money maker for the United States up until this point right now, actually not up until right now, is basically war, weapons manufacturing. That's all it produces. That's all it does, right? And so what does that mean for the rest of us? Well, like I said, what it means is that just being alive and living gets harder and harder every day, right? You have the statistics that say, you know, what was that? It's like 50% of folks who make $100,000 are living check to check. That's supposed to make $100,000. Imagine the folks under that, right? Capitalism is moving into this extreme state of crisis where it is just no longer sustainable for anybody, right? And the consequences of capitalism have always have to be managed, and always managed by who? This armed body of men, these police, right? Who have this monopoly on state violence. And so what happens is that through this counterinsurgency, as uprisings continue to grow and uprisings continue to happen, right? You need a body of men to be able to suppress that and put that down, because things are not going to get easier for us. They're only going to get worse, but folks are going to still keep, and not folks, right? But the wealthy, the rich 1%, are going to continue to try to squeeze every little bit out of us they can until the planet is dead, until we're dead. They have no other plan other than just keep milking us for everything we have. And so we're moving into a period of serious, serious confrontation, and they know that, and they've always known that, right? Going back to what I said, the organization of society based off of like the moral protection, they've been known this, which is why they're doing this in school, which is why they're building up, right, for that eventual fight. When we look at George Jackson, who I idolize, and George Jackson is everything, right? George said fascism is already here. And we understand fascism to be the way he articulated it as the marriage between monopoly capital and the state, right? And fascism has already been here since way back, right? And a lot of us are used to or thinking of fascism in terms of jackboot Nazis, right? And Mussolini, and those sorts of this very extreme violence that comes. But it's already been here. It's about that merger of corporate America, Betsy DeVos, Blackwater, deciding what children learn in our schools, right? And the state. And so we've already been living in that period, but we're moving to that very violent piece. Right now, up as of 2020, police and prison expenditures, right? So what is spent on police and prisons is about $277 billion. $25 billion more than what China spends on its entire military, right? And that's for a reason. It's that counterinsurgency, right? Right now, the United States spends more on policing. It's third in the nation in military spending. If you take how much is spent on police in the U.S., ranks third in the world in military spending, right? And so what does that mean for schools? Well, in 1975, 1% of schools in the United States had a police officer in their building. As of today, we're up to about 61% of schools in the United States, right, have police in their building. More and more funding goes into, through No Child Left Behind, and all these other federal programs, right, goes into policing of our schools. And it's not just every school. So those of you who, anyway, teach or have gone to school in Philadelphia. Yes, right? Masterman High School is over like on Spring Garden or whatever. 1 block away is Benjamin Franklin High School, right, where Mumia went to, right? Masterman High School has 1 SRO, 1 security officer for a building that holds, I don't know, a large number, so it's both the middle school and the high school, 1. Benjamin Franklin High School, when I was the director of student union up until 2017, had at least 8 SROs and then an army of motorcycle police and police cruisers outside at let out for the school. 1 block away, right, from the magnet school that's considered probably the best in the state of Pennsylvania, right? And so you already see who the state understands to be the insurgency, who the state sees is going to be an eventual problem as this crisis continues to grow and grow and grow, right? And so what do they use? Well, they use school shootings, right? The phenomenon of school shootings as a rationale for this is why we have to arm police. This is why we have to have cops in schools. But we know that's not the case because the school to prison pipeline has shown us that it's more about funneling those students, right, who couldn't pass those standardized tests that I was talking about before, who are going to drive the test scores down of those schools lower, out of the school, so that school doesn't get closed. Because now you have principals and teachers have to make a career decision as to, do I lose my job and lose this school because this student who probably doesn't speak English very well, who probably has a learning disability, who probably has all kinds of other stuff, but my school has been stripped of all kinds of resources, so we can't help this kid, but we're going to give them this crazy ass test to try and pass with the most minimal amount of preparation for it, right? In a building that, again, that has asbestos, because police schools had asbestos, with no heat and no air conditioning in the summer. So what do? They push them out. I grew up in New Haven, Connecticut. I started working in New Haven, Connecticut. That school to prison pipeline for us looked like there was the main Hill House High School, predominantly black high school in the city of New Haven. 1 block away was the auxiliary school, where they took those students who couldn't pass the test and stuck them in another school, right? Where was that school housed? In a National Guard armory that held Humvees and weapons and armed U.S. soldiers inside of it. So a little piece of that building, right, was cordoned off for those students who said we have behavioral issues, learning deficiencies, and all that. Right next to that school, when you look out the window, 20 feet away was what? It was a juvenile detention center. So they could see some of their friends behind the fence with barbed wire playing basketball when they were let out or whatever, and the family court right there. 2 blocks up from there, right, was the New Haven Police Academy. And on 1 block, you had your school to prison pipeline, and the military was there. Because then you had this issue that, of course, the students would build relationships with these men and women in this building, and then all hell would break loose when the New Haven Register report, oh, private whatever, was blown up in Iraq because of an IED or whatever, and private whatever was just here 2 months ago with us talking about basketball or whatever. Right? These are the conditions that we have been in. That was 2004, right? That we have been in. So then what happens, right? We all saw with Ferguson, the militarization of police. Because, again, war becomes the industry, right? The military-industrial complex. War becomes the industry. Everything becomes a war. It's a war on poverty. It's a war on drugs. It's a war on terrorism. It's a war on, and wars need militaries to fight. And now that war has come home, right? And you need these police officers to be able to fight that war, and the war that is current, that insurgency that is inevitably going to come, right? Because there is going to be nothing left. And we already saw it with the Floyd uprisings. We see it where the protests to police violence keep escalating and escalating to now police departments getting burned down, right? Cruisers are being burned down. A whole new crop of potential future political prisoners, right, are being sought in, like the case of Ent and all that stuff, right? And so then what you have is this 1033 program. And the 1033 program basically says that surplus weapons from the United States military that weren't used or were used in Iraq and Afghanistan can now be given for free to police departments. All they have to do is fill out a 1-page application, say what it is that you want, right? If you get approved, which most will get approved, you are giving all kinds of military vehicles and weaponry. But who wants in on that game? School police, right? School police also are given 1033 military-grade weapons, right, to protect our schools from mass shooters and all that. Now, we know mass shootings happen, unfortunately, like in the burbs, but the ones who get most police and these military weapons are urban schools, are city schools, right? And so just recently, back in 2010, I believe it was, the LAUSD and the young people, the high school students who fought this campaign, because a lot of the, and maybe it's a bias because I did that work with them with so many, but the folks who were first talking about police-free worlds, we're starting with a police-free school, we're high school students. A lot of, when we think about young people, we think about college students now, right? And the work that's come up with Trayvon Martin and Dream Defenders and those kind of folks, and it's wonderful, it's great. But a lot of that work started with high school students as early as 2000, 2001, 2002, right? Dealing with this issue of over-policing the weapons. It was high school students who were able to get 6 grenade launchers taken out of the hands of the school police in the LAUSD. Grenade launchers. The Miami School District had an attack helicopter. 26 school districts have 1033 grade weapons in their schools, in Florida and Michigan, right, and across the country. MRAPs. MRAPs are those giant military vehicles or whatever. They have those for schools. For schools. Right? again, in preparation for the counterinsurgency that is coming. And so how does that wrap up into Iraq? And this was funny because you talk about Abu Ghraib a lot, right? And Nazi has done a great job like raising and never letting us forget the horrors that happened in Abu Ghraib. George Jackson, again, back in 1970, was talking about the creation of solitary confinement, and he referred to them as tiger cages, right? Tiger cages. Tiger cages was a name given to the holes that were dug in the ground in Vietnam, where they would take men, women, and children, Vietnamese men, women, and children, stick them in the hole and torture them, right? Sometimes kill them and torture. Those were tiger cages. The man who was responsible for that, his name was Donald Brodenkircher, right? Who happened to be in Vietnam, right? The head during that whole tiger cage episode, who then became the warden and the head of all California prison systems, right? And instituted the SHU, right? The special housing unit, right? These extreme solitary confinement units in prison because again, they're sites of counterinsurgency. Vietnam was about counterinsurgency, right? A lot of the war on terror is about against counterinsurgency, right? They brought that to the prison system. In 2005, right? I think 2005 is when Abu Ghraib happens in the horse. Who was sent over to go deal with that? Donald Brodenkircher, right? Why? Because the folks who committed those atrocities in Abu Ghraib were former corrections officers. They took their U.S. prison system, brought it over there, applied the Vietnam torture, right, elements and the torture that happens inside the political prisons and the prisons, and brought it over to Iraq. And then when that got exposed, then they brought it where? Guantanamo, where none of us can see it, right? And so as we move and as we continue, we see this further escalation of not only the militarization of police, right, but the globalizing of U.S. policing as well. Because it was under the surveillance of Muslim communities in this country after Iraq is when the NYPD starts having folks out in Baghdad. The NYPD, right? So then in Iraq you have the CIA, the FBI, the NYPD, and every other alphabet organization now would know who they are. I can't remember who they are, right? Over there exporting that policing. You have the IDF coming from occupied Palestine to train police here in this country, right, on how to choke people out, how to kill people, right, how to suppress, again, insurgency from an unruly native population, right, who is suffering underneath colonialism and extreme capitalism, right? And now what we have now is Cop City, where what you're trying to do is create, and what you're planning to create is a school of the Americas for police. The School of the Americas, where since the 60s and the 70s, all of Latin America's extreme right-wing military dictators and torturers were trained at Fort Benning in Georgia. And to this day, that's called nothing but hell and I mean atrocities across the Caribbean and Latin America as a result. And now you want to do that for police in Atlanta, Georgia. And so for those of us and folks who are part of organizations, right, and specifically also organizations, that is imperative to look at not just what is happening, but to take a step back, right, that method of analysis, and take that step back to look at the broader picture and the economics of all this, and the construction of society, to see where is it that we're going to better plan, because that confrontation is coming whether we want to see it or not. And their side is preparing for it, and preparing for it in our schools, and also through the police departments, in the name of our safety, right, in the names of fighting terror, in the names of producing a better world, which only means more profit for them and the destruction of the planet and bondage, right, sending us all back into chains if they can, for the rest of us.
Right. I can take you personal notes. I'm not going to go home and do my own research. One of the quotes that I took of yours that you just said was, war becomes the industry and everything becomes war. And it makes me think about this like fascinating connection between capital and spending. We're talking about police expenditures and order and violence and education. And so I want to open up the floor for anyone who has any questions on any of those topics or anything surrounding perhaps war on terror, things that come to my mind that I'll ask some questions about later, whether one-on-one or in this space is the future of war in the United States, especially as the U.S. empire and hegemony is being challenged right now. So those are the sort of things that I'm thinking about. We're seeing other countries fighting for the throne right now, and the weakening of U.S. political power. And so 20 years later, is the U.S. as strong of a political or military force as it once was? I'm just sort of rambling, waiting for people to ask a question, but don't be shy. Yes, please.
So I'd like to hear from any or all of you about the experience of being a radical educator in this education system. What are the challenges and the risks that are faced, and what are some of the effective ways, if any, to actually get through and properly educate students?
Dr. Patrick.
Well, I'll be brief, because you heard me talk about this a lot, but when I got, so, you know, like the kind of job that I have, like an academic tenured position, even at a school like where I work at Stockton, it's not like a very elite institution or whatever. A lot of people want that job. I mean, especially in a discipline like anthropology, you know, they crank out PhDs and the job market is just not there. And so when I got this job, you know, my committee in grad school, my advisors, they were very excited for me to land in a tenure track position before I was even done with my dissertation. And not one, but two of them pulled me aside separately and were like, so you have this job, you want to get tenure, don't talk about Palestine. Just don't do it. Of course, I did not take their advice, but I think that you can learn a lot about American militarism and the education system by looking at the question of Palestine and U.S. support for Israeli apartheid, also known as Israel. So, and the reason I say that is because you're raising these questions, for instance, of these deadly exchange programs, right? How American police go over and train with the IOF, the Israeli Occupation Forces. But you've also seen like this remarkable assault on educators, and not just university professors, but, you know, K-12 teachers who are in support of the BDS movement, literally a nonviolent boycott movement, who lose their jobs, who, you know, or are denied tenure, or even after getting tenure are fired. And I think that can tell us about how these counterinsurgency tactics sort of work in academic spaces. There's a lot more to be said about that, especially around issues of like teachers' unions and university unions and how depoliticized or apolitical they are, or perhaps they are political, but in the ways that just shore up the power of the Democratic Party, that shore up the power of the military-industrial complex. We can also talk about the gutting of resources for us, just like the lack of material support we have. I mean, all of these are attacks on intellectual life, you know? I mean, everyone who knows a teacher knows someone who's struggling to pay their bills, you know, and that's, we have to think of that in these political terms as well.
I'll just say two things. One, I'm trying to impose my radical political agenda on sixth graders right now. We're learning about world geography and the 7 continents. And one question that I ask in all the quizzes is, name a country and who it was colonized by. But I realized I had to take a step back because they didn't know what colonization was. And I was like, right, because you're as well. The second point that I think about is, so I sort of happened to stumble into teaching middle school. Prior to that, you know, I do hardcore data analysis and research, and one of the clients that I had was a textbook company trying to rebrand or refresh their curriculum, their online curriculum, and so they asked some economists to come up with some interesting topics that speak to contemporary economic policy. So it's not as dry, so it's not 2003 textbook material. What would people want to know today, you know, from the background of somebody who is a non-traditional sort of academic? And I was talking about Haiti and imperialism or whatever, and they told me that I had the space to talk about anything that I wanted, but then when I got the notes back, it was just edit, 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 and at the end, it was this diluted version of what I wanted to say. And so when you ask, like, what are some of the challenges that I face, I think, you know, trying to pacify the point or make things this lukewarm version, or how do you say things without getting fired from your job? Are the parents going to get suspicious of me talking about, imperialism to their children? Yeah. Questions? Does anyone else have a question? I'm also going to start teaching at the community college in Philadelphia in the fall. So I'm very curious about what my teaching style is going to be with the difference. There's going to be a 10-year age difference mostly. So I'll circle back to your question next fall. Any other questions?
So it's a little bit of a non sequitur, but it seems like war crimes are more of a norm than an exception. So when these people who've gone out there and they've done these horrible things, how do they reintegrate into society when they come back to the United States? Like, what are these people doing? How these serial killers, like, they're among us, right?
I think they get top appointments in government positions.
Or they become cops.
They become cops.
A lot of them come back and become cops. And what you see is also a lot of the rise of these tactical training schools. So you have these former Navy SEALs and special forces supposed to come back all messed up, and since 18 years old, the only thing they've known how to do is kill. And the only skill they have is to kill people. And so basically to deal, and the way they justify is to deal with their own PTSD and the trauma, but the trauma of spending your life going around the world killing people and seeing your friends die, is to continue to go through that sort of like almost robotic process of that same training of doing that thing and teaching. But what they do is they're teaching them to police officers, right? Because it's sort of this whole like we're all in uniform protecting the state, that sort of thing. But what we also know from like FBI reports back in like the early 2000s, again around this time, is that police departments have been intentionally infiltrated and filled with white supremacists and neo-Nazis, right? And so then there's this overlap with Proud Boys and 1%ers or 3%ers and all these different groups who also go to these, either are able to go to these tactical trainings or are getting the training secondhand in preparation for the Civil War, right, that they're convinced is going to happen. So one, it's a fight against the state because they have their own sort of libertarian crazy stuff around fighting the state. Fighting the state is not crazy, but the way they understand it is some other shit, right? And then fighting against us, right? And as the climate crisis happens, is why they're all intentionally concentrated in sort of like highland mountainous areas, because they also understand that the coastal cities and coastal areas will be unlivable pretty quickly, and there's going to be a fight for resources, and that is their time to shine, right? In a country that has over 400,000 weapons and only about 400 million weapons, 325 million people, there are more guns than there are people, right? This becomes a really serious thing. So they are murderers. They're coming back. They're training the cops. They will be employed to train at places like Cop City, but they're also training white supremacists, neo-Nazis, and all those folks for this right civil war that they're planning on coming.
Don't get mental health piece. Suicide, mental health.
Right, and so that's what I was saying, right? This is how, for some of them, they've been able to continue to get a paycheck because the VA has abandoned them, right? And has medically discharged them. Many of them are committing suicide, drug addicted, and trying to find ways to work out of that. And the only thing they know how to do is kill. And so now they just teach people how to kill, right? In the name of like public safety.
Hi. So I was too young to remember the anti-war movement during the Iraq War, but I can see a lot of the lies that were peddled during the Iraq War and during the Vietnam War. Some of those lies still continue on, and also lies that are being created and fabricated about other countries, right? Like namely Venezuela, Cuba, China. And so as a community organizer that is trying to build this new anti-war movement today and in our city, there's a lot of trouble, difficulties that we face in even just getting the working class to talk about, these other countries, some countries where they might have emigrated from, or like they're just too busy like dealing with their own working conditions to even think about, what is happening abroad. So like I really want to know, and these are like this question is for everyone in the room, like, how do we build this new anti-war movement today, especially when there's this giant boogeyman in the room with, all the time, and that boogeyman being socialism and being, communism. So yeah, I just wanted to hear from like, comrades' experience and thoughts. Audience.
So, funny thing is, like the first quote that comes to mind isn't by any communist, it's like Dwight Eisenhower, right? Famous war criminal. That every bomb that's built is in an ultimate sense a direct robbery from society, right? So basically, it's that. We're spending about $900 million on war. Then there's the external costs, like the nuclear program, like Veterans Affairs, like the domestic occupation known as the police. Right, we're spending an easy $1.5 trillion a year while society rots away. And we're spending it not only are we wasting this money directly, there's no future for imperialism. Eventually this system will implode, and we will have just blown up all that tremendous social wealth for nothing. So rather than using it to build society, we're using it to actively destroy society, actively sabotage the future. So it's really important to understand that one of the biggest investments is war, and that investment has to be directly confronted. And yeah, that's all I got.
Basically, like what are some of the problems that you see today that the anti-war movement is facing, and how do we overcome that?
Okay, if I may, good evening, everyone. My name is Thomas Gordon Kumature. I thought I was a cheater and co-conspirator. I think that's a good question because for two reasons. If you look at the Rage Against the War Machine thing that happened in February, and then the other anti-war thing that happened later with DSL and other groups, I think what became apparent to me anyway is how and where and why we engage in political education to figure these things out. Because for some of us, we were not going to attend a Rage Against the War Machine anti-war event when you could fight the Libertarian Party. Period. I don't deal with no fascists. I don't deal with no racists, no transphobes. I ain't dealing with none of that. And I don't deal with anybody who's against the union. If my mama was against the union, I'd be against her too. Let's be real. The other part of that is, I think for those of us as people of color, we are going to have to really struggle with how the class struggle among our people is going to look like. And it's going to be messy. I'll give you two good examples. Cop City. A few months ago, here come all the Black men's leadership class rolling out for a photo op, giving their support to Cop City, and they rolled out Andrew Young in a wheelchair. Like Andrew Young don't remember the police beating up on them when they were in SCLC back in the day. The other part of that is we had some jack-legged Black preachers here in Philadelphia came out in support of the 76ers arena. And I called one of them out. And I told him that you're selling us out for less than 30 pieces of silver. Now, if you know your Bible, if you sell yourself out that cheap, then who are you really representing? I'm not sure we're ready for that kind of struggle. And that's going to be really real and messy. And you may have to go up against your mama, your best friend, your favorite cousin, and all of them. Even Big Mama may act fool. Just go up against Big Mama too. So our political education has to prepare us for those kind of struggles. Otherwise, it's going to be a real mess. I mean, look, like I said, look at Top City in Atlanta, the Mecca. Civil rights leaders rolling out to support Top City. right? So that's something we have to think about as well. And I'm not sure necessarily what that would look like, but we're gonna have to take it seriously.
I think the only thing I would add to that in terms of overcoming challenges, right, and looking at the room, is join an organization. Join a close organization. Right? A radical revolution organization, right? There's PSL, there's a big one now. There's the Answer Coalition, the Black Lives for Peace in the Zone, right? The Zone for Peace campaign. There are organizations that have been actively involved for decades at this point in anti-war stuff. It may not get the same level of notoriety that it once did at a certain point, but doesn't mean that it's gone, right? And so there's two organizations, at least I know, in the room right now who are working actively on those issues. And what Asante said about political education and all that, sign up, go to a meeting, ask questions, learn. There are plenty of folks out there who are doing it.
So on that note of organizations, we do have room for one more question if anyone wants to squeeze it in. That's all. Yes, please.
Cool. So, anyone who's super duper close to me right now knows that I have become a cynophile of late. And so, a cynophile means someone who really admires China.
Trying to what?
Anyway, so I wanted to ask both of y'all, or the entire panel, if y'all is, I know that the Chinese Foreign Ministry has recently come out with a document highlighting U.S. hegemony and the violence of the hegemony. And then I saw that Russia also had a similar document that recently just came out, although I have yet to read that one. And so with the rise of multipolarism, especially when it comes to Central Asia and the, I guess, like consolidating solidarity to kind of act as a bulwark against U.S. imperialism and Western hegemony. How are we seeing that inform the populace and what they are coming to know with these, global powers speaking out against U.S. imperialism and hegemony? How are we seeing that?
Such a great, thank you. I think one of the things that is true of American warfare is the prior war is always leveraged into support for the current war. So on the 20th anniversary of the U.S. invasion of Iraq, the entire American media was rewriting the history of what happened, right? So we did not hear about the millions of people around the world who took the streets in 2003 in protest of the war. NPR, is that not National Propaganda Radio? NPR had a piece that said, well, of course there were some blunders made, but here are the silver linings of the war in Iraq, and how, elections have a lot of integrity there now, and this and that, and it was like, wow, you guys really want us to be okay with American warfare, so we will support whatever you're about to do with China, right? And they think we can't see that. It's just so transparent. The ways the prior war is leveraged in support for a current war. But I will say something that's pretty terrifying based on my time in the university classroom. Over the last couple of years, students who are coming from high school into the university classroom have been taught in their history classes, where they're not being taught anything else about the human rights violations carried out by China. Those lessons are in the school book, like the American political project, the Pivot to Asia, is there in your 8th grade kids class, I promise you. And it's really interesting because then I'm like, when you're teaching about these things, you have to think on your feet a lot. And you're like, well, wait, you all came in being taught about whatever you were taught about, sweatshops, Uyghurs, environmental pollution carried out by China, and all this stuff. And you're like, wow, I really have to recalibrate what we're going to talk about in this class, which is about American empire. Yeah. Right? So for those of you who are in the classroom or do any of this work, it's just something to keep your eye on. Is that this ideological war is already underway.
I have nothing to add to that. Read yourselves. Oh yeah. Oh, you said what?
Read mouth.
Yes.
Read mouth.
Oh yeah, exactly. And you mentioned angles earlier too. Clap it up for yourselves. So this is the part of our night where we do some shameless plugging. And so again, my name is Saskia. I am a member of the Black Alliance for Peace. Yeah, and it's no surprise that BAP is in this room right now because Black Alliance for Peace is an anti-war, anti-imperial, pro-peace organization under the Black radical
That's
tradition.
right.
And so when we're talking about anti-war, even in places outside of Black nations, we can see so many parallels to what's going on, whether we're talking about Iraq or Haiti or Colombia or Honduras or Philly. And so that Philly is doing a lot of that political work in trying to free political prisoners like Mumia and like Anthony Smith, who recently had, his hearing. And also globally, like in our campaign right now, we have a Zone of Peace campaign, thank you, which is trying to build peace in Latin America and the Caribbean. So, plenty of programs that we have, trying to get U.S. out of Africa, or, U.S. out of anywhere, U.S. out of everywhere. And so if you guys want to plug in your political organizations or anybody you want to plug.
Well, you're here at the Philly Liberation Center. The Party for Socialism and Liberation does so much, both locally and globally. We do solidarity work with Cuba. We are at the forefront of the movement to bring attention to what will happen if an arena is built in downtown Philadelphia. So there's a lot. Keep your eye on our social media, our Instagram. Come to our events here. We've always got something happening here. And for those of you it's your first time, welcome.
I don't have any organization, but there is a caravan and trip to Washington, D.C. on June 25th to support the campaign to remove Cuba off the list of state-sponsored terrorists. So continue attacks on Cuba, right, and ideological, but also economic attacks on the example of socialism in practice 90 miles off the United States shore. So the Cuban Revolution definitely needs our help more than ever at this point. So if you can make it June 25th, Washington, D.C.
Yes. Join an organization. Are there any other organizations in this room right now outside of the ones that have already been named? No?
Don't be shy.
That's okay. There have already been plenty mentioned. And so if you're interested in any of the things that we talked about today, feel free to talk to any of us. There's also members of the Black Alliance for Peace and PSL in the room. Also the Liberation Center and many volunteers that come and give their service. And so I guess with that, that's a scene. That's a wrap, folks. Thank you.